You're tired of how tightly you've been holding on, aren't you? Not just to people or plans or outcomes, but to the belief that if you let go, everything will fall apart. You've spent so long gripping, controlling, trying to keep life from slipping through your fingers that your hands have forgotten what it feels like to be open. And somewhere beneath the exhaustion, there's a quiet fear that if you stop holding on, you'll lose everything that matters. But what if the opposite is true? What if the very act of holding on is what's keeping you trapped? What if the tighter you grip, the more life pulls away? For thousands of years, Buddhist wisdom has pointed to a simple truth. Suffering doesn't come from what happens to you. It comes from how you respond to it, from the stories you tell, from the way you cling to what should stay and resist what needs to go. And once you see that, really see it, something begins to shift. There's a version of you that doesn't wake up already braced for disappointment, a version that can love without fear, work without desperation, and care deeply without falling apart when things don't go your way. Not because life became easier, but because you stopped fighting it. In this video, you're going to understand why holding on creates the very loss you fear and what it actually means to let go without giving up. Act 1. The illusion of control. You're exhausted, aren't you? Not the kind of tired that sleep can fix. The kind that lives in your chest. The kind that makes you wake up already worried about what might go wrong today. You've been holding on so tightly for so long that your hands have forgotten what it feels like to be open. You hold on to people, afraid they'll leave. You hold on to plans, terrified they'll fall apart. You hold on to the version of yourself you think you're supposed to be, even when it doesn't fit anymore. And somewhere along the way, you started to believe that letting go meant losing, that if you stopped gripping so hard, everything you care about would slip through your fingers like sand. You were taught that surrender is what weak people do, that persistence is noble, that if you just try harder, control more, plan better, everything will finally fall into place. But here's what no one told you. The harder you hold on, the more you lose yourself. Think about the last time you tried to control something that mattered to you. Maybe it was a relationship. You kept checking their messages, reading between the lines, adjusting your words to get the response you wanted. Or maybe it was your career. You stayed late, said yes when you meant no, twisted yourself into shapes that didn't feel like you anymore, hoping someone would finally notice. Or maybe it's something quieter, the way you try to manage how people see you, the way you rehearse conversations in your head, planning every word so nothing goes wrong. You thought you were protecting yourself. But control doesn't protect you. It just makes the cage smaller. There's an old Zen story about a man who found a beautiful wild bird with a broken wing. He took it home, built it a cage, fed it every day, kept it safe from danger. The wing healed, but the bird stopped singing. The man didn't understand. He gave it everything it needed. What he didn't realize was that the bird didn't need safety. It needed sky. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for something you love is stop holding it so tightly. You've been living in a cage of your own making. And the bars are made of what-ifs. And I have to, and if I don't, then... But here's the disruption, the crack in everything you've believed. What if the opposite is true? What if holding on is exactly why things keep slipping away? Think about it. When you grasp water in your fist, it runs through your fingers. When you hold your breath, your body panics. When you chase someone who's pulling away, they run faster. Life doesn't respond well to force. It never has. The tighter you squeeze, the more it resists. Not because life is cruel, but because life is alive. and alive things need space to breathe. You've been taught that if you stop chasing, everything will disappear. But maybe the truth is simpler and stranger than that. Maybe things disappear because you're chasing them. Maybe people pull away because they can feel your grip. Maybe opportunities close because you're standing in the doorway, afraid to let them pass naturally. The Buddha never said, cling to everything and exhaust yourself. He said, holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. But it's not just anger we hold on to. It's control. It's outcomes. It's the story of how life is supposed to go. And all of it, every single ounce of that holding, is poison we keep swallowing, wondering why we feel so sick. You're not failing because you're not trying hard enough. You're failing because you're trying to control what was never meant to be forced. There's a reason your shoulders are always tight, a reason you can't sleep even when you're tired, a reason you feel like you're constantly bracing for impact. It's because you're living like life is something to be wrestled into submission instead of something to be lived. You've been in a fight with reality, and reality doesn't lose. It just waits. It waits for you to get tired enough to stop pushing, to stop performing, to stop pretending you're the one holding everything together. And when you finally stop, that's not when everything falls apart. That's when something truer can finally begin. Maybe the problem isn't that you haven't tried hard enough. Maybe you've been trying to control what was never meant to be forced. Maybe it's time to unclench your fists, not because you're giving up, but because you're finally ready to receive. Act 2, the paradox of letting go. So if holding on is the problem, does that mean you just stop caring? Do you become one of those people who shrug at everything, who say whatever happens, happens with that empty look in their eyes? Is detachment just another word for giving up? No. And this is where most people get it wrong. Detachment is not the absence of care. It's the presence of freedom. It's caring deeply, loving fully, trying your best but without making your peace dependent on how things turn out. It's the difference between holding someone's hand and handcuffing yourself to them. One is connection, the other is captivity. You can still want things. You can still work toward them. You can still hope and plan and dream. But you stop strangling life with the demand that it must look a certain way or you'll fall apart. You stop making your happiness hostage to outcomes you cannot control. And that shift, that small but seismic shift, changes everything. Think about water for a moment. If you try to grab it with a closed fist, it runs through your fingers. You end up with almost nothing, just dampness and frustration. But if you cup your hands gently, openly, the water stays. It rests there, not because you're holding it, but because you're not forcing it. Life works the same way. The things you chase run from you. The things you try to control slip away. But when you stop grasping, when you offer space instead of pressure, suddenly there's room for something real to exist. Or think about breathing. You can't hold your breath and expect to live. You have to let go of each breath to make space for the next one. Inhale. Exhale. Receive. Release. It's a rhythm, not a battle. You don't cling to the air in your lungs. You trust that more will come. That's what detachment is. It's trusting the rhythm of life enough to stop holding your breath. There's a reason the ocean doesn't apologize when the tide goes out. It knows it will return. It doesn't cling to the shore, desperate to stay. It retreats. It lets go. And because it lets go, it can come back again and again, endlessly. That's the paradox. Letting go is not the end of connection. It's what makes real connection possible. But here's where it gets tricky. where the mind tries to trick you into thinking you understand when you don't. There's a difference between intention and attachment, and if you don't know the difference, you'll confuse the two and exhaust yourself all over again. Intention is planting a seed. You choose the soil, you water it, you give it sunlight, you do everything in your power to create the conditions for growth, and then you step back. You let the seed do what seeds do. You don't dig it up every day to check if it's sprouting. You don't scream at it for not growing fast enough. You trust the process that's larger than you. Attachment is digging up the seed every single day. It's checking, measuring, panicking when you don't see results on your timeline. It's lying awake at night wondering if you did enough, if it's working, if it will ever work. It's making your worthiness dependent on whether the seed becomes a tree. That's not care. That's fear wearing the mask of care. You can have intention without attachment. You can want something deeply and also be okay if it doesn't happen the way you pictured. Not because you don't care, but because you're not enslaved by the outcome. Your peace isn't sitting on the other side of success. It's here, now, whether the seed blooms or not. The Buddha once said, "You only lose what you cling to, not what you love, not what you value, what you cling to." Because clinging turns love into a leash. It turns hope into desperation. It turns effort into suffering. And the sad irony is that the tighter you cling, the more you guarantee the loss you're trying to prevent. So what does it actually feel like to let go? Not in theory, but in your body, in your daily life. It feels like your shoulders dropping 2 inches when you didn't even realize they were up by your ears. It feels like being able to sit with uncertainty without your chest tightening. It feels like seeing someone you love make a choice you wouldn't make and not needing to fix them. It feels like working hard on something and knowing that whether it works out or not, you're still okay. Not pretending to be okay. Actually okay. It's not numbness. It's not detachment in the cold, distant sense. It's being fully alive without being enslaved by outcomes. You feel everything. You care about everything. But you've stopped making your inner peace conditional on life behaving the way you want it to. And here's what no one tells you about that kind of freedom. It makes you better at everything. When you're not terrified of losing, you stop playing defense. You stop second-guessing every move. You stop performing. You start showing up as you actually are, not as the person you think you need to be to keep everything from falling apart. And people feel that. Life feels that. Opportunities that were blocked by your desperation suddenly have space to arrive. When you stop demanding that life move on your timeline, that it answers your questions right now, that it gives you proof before you take the next step, something deeper takes over. Not magical thinking, not passivity, a deeper intelligence. The same intelligence that turns seeds into trees without asking for permission. The same intelligence that heals your body while you sleep. The same intelligence that's been keeping your heart beating this entire time without you having to remember. You've been trying so hard to steer the river. Maybe it's time to trust that the river knows where it's going. Act 3. Karma versus control. But wait. If you're supposed to let go, does that mean you just sit back and do nothing? Do you stop trying? Stop working? Stop caring about results? Just float through life, hoping the universe delivers what you need? No. And this is the part where people misunderstand detachment and turn it into an excuse for laziness or avoidance. Letting go of outcomes doesn't mean abandoning responsibility. It means understanding where your power actually lives. Here's what most people get wrong about karma. They think it's fate. They think it means what's meant to be will be in some mystical, predetermined way. like your life is a movie that's already been filmed and you're just watching it play out. That's not karma, that's fatalism. And fatalism is just another way of giving up your power. Karma is cause and effect. It's physics, not magic. You plant a seed, a tree grows. You speak with kindness, kindness echoes back. You act with integrity, your life begins to align. You lie, cut corners, harm others, and that energy doesn't just disappear, it circulates, it comes back. Not as punishment from some cosmic judge, but as the natural consequence of what you set in motion. You don't control outcomes, but you are fully, completely, undeniably responsible for causes. And that's where your energy should go. Not into obsessing over results, not into trying to manipulate how things turn out, but into being impeccable with the causes you create, because that's the only part that's actually yours. Think of your life as having 3 domains, 3 areas where energy flows, and only 2 of them belong to you. The first domain is your character. This is who you are when no one's watching. Your integrity, your patience, your honesty, the way you treat people when there's nothing to gain, the way you keep promises to yourself, the small daily choices that shape the person you're becoming. This is yours, completely, utterly yours. No one can take it from you. No circumstance can strip it away. You can work on this every single day, and it will never be wasted effort. The second domain is your craft, your skills, your preparation, your effort. If you're building something, you refine it. If you're learning something, you practice. If you're healing something, you show up to the work. You do your research. You ask for help. You put in the hours. Not because it guarantees success, but because it's your part to play. This is also yours. You control how much you learn, how hard you work, how deeply you commit. But the third domain, that's not yours. And this is where most of your suffering lives. The third domain is conditions, timing, how other people react, whether the world is ready for what you're offering, whether the opportunity opens when you need it to, whether someone loves you back, whether your work gets recognized, whether the pieces fall into place the way you hoped. You can influence conditions, sometimes, but you cannot control them. And every moment you spend trying to control them is a moment you've abandoned your actual power. There's an old story about an archer. He's one of the best in the land. He spends years perfecting his form, his focus, his breath. When the day of the great competition comes, he steps up to the line. He feels the weight of the bow. He sees the target clearly. He breathes in. He aims. And then, in one smooth motion, he releases the arrow. And the moment it leaves his hand, he closes his eyes. The crowd gasps. Why did you close your eyes? Don't you want to see if it hits the target? And the archer says, my job was to aim and release. What happens after that is not my domain. If I chase the arrow with my eyes, with my hope, with my desperation, I'm trying to control what I've already set in motion, and that's where peace dies. The arrow hit the center, but that's not the point of the story. The point is that he would have had the same peace whether it did or not, because his peace didn't depend on the outcome. It depended on knowing he did his part with full presence and then let it go. You're not an archer, but you live the same truth every day. You send the email. You have the hard conversation. You create the thing. You show up with honesty, and then you release it. You don't chase it mid-air. You don't obsess over how it lands. You trust that if you aimed well, if you put care into the cause, the effect will take care of itself. This is not passivity. This is the most active, awake, empowered way to live. You pour everything into what you can control, your character, your craft, and you stop exhausting yourself trying to control what you can't. You work hard, but the work doesn't make you sick. You care deeply, but the caring doesn't turn into desperation. You give your best, and then you step back. Not because you don't care about results, but because you know that your worth isn't tied to them. The Buddha said, the root of suffering is attachment, but he also said, your work is to discover your work, and then with all your heart give yourself to it. See the balance, effort and release, intention and surrender. You're not supposed to stop trying. You're supposed to stop tying your peace to outcomes. When you understand this, really understand it in your bones, something shifts. You stop walking around with that low-level hum of anxiety that never quite goes away. You stop performing for approval. You stop second-guessing every decision, wondering if it was the right one. You just do the next right thing with as much care as you can, and then you let it unfold. And that kind of clarity, that kind of clean action, is rare. It's powerful. People feel it. Life responds to it. But just when we think we've understood letting go, just when we think we've figured out how to be detached and present at the same time, a subtler trap appears. And this one is quieter, harder to see, more dangerous, because it hides behind the appearance of wisdom. Act 4. The ego of detachment. The trap is this. You start to become proud of how detached you are. You notice it in small ways at first. Someone gets upset, and you stay calm. Someone panics, and you don't. You watch people chase things you've let go of, and there's a quiet whisper in your mind that says, I'm beyond that now. You're not controlling outcomes anymore. You're not desperate. You're not clinging. And somewhere in that shift, without you even noticing, a new identity forms. The identity of being someone who's detached, someone who's evolved, someone who's figured it out. And that's when detachment becomes just another thing the ego wears. The ego is clever. It doesn't disappear when you start doing inner work. It just changes costumes. It learns the language. It memorizes the phrases. It watches you meditate, watches you let go, watches you stop reacting, and it says, good, now I can be the person who doesn't need anything. And suddenly, detachment isn't freedom anymore. It's a new prison, a quieter one, a more sophisticated one, but still a prison. You start saying things like, I'm above drama, nothing really affects me anymore, I just don't care about those things. And on the surface, it sounds like wisdom, it sounds like peace. But underneath, if you're honest, it's not peace, it's distance. It's a way of staying safe, a way of not feeling, a way of protecting yourself by pretending you're beyond being hurt. This is false detachment, and it's everywhere. You see it in people who've read all the books, done all the practices, and somehow ended up colder than they were before. They don't yell anymore, they don't cry, they don't get messy, but they also don't connect. They've confused equanimity with numbness. They've mistaken stillness for emotional shutdown. And the sad part is, they think they've arrived. They think this is enlightenment. But it's not. It's just fear wearing a spiritual mask. True detachment feels deeply. It loves without condition. It cares without clinging. It allows you to be present with pain, with joy, with uncertainty, without needing to control it or push it away. You feel everything, but you don't drown in it. You're in the ocean, but you're also learning how to swim. False detachment doesn't feel. It avoids. It builds walls and calls them boundaries. It hides fear behind silence and calls it inner peace. It watches life happen from a distance and convinces itself that distance is wisdom. But it's not wisdom, it's withdrawal. And deep down, you know the difference. Because true peace makes you softer, false detachment makes you harder. There's a story about a Zen master who lived in a small village. One day, a fire broke out and destroyed several homes, including his own. His students watched him closely, expecting him to remain calm, unbothered, a perfect example of detachment. And he was calm, but he also cried. He sat in the ashes of his home and wept. One of his students, confused, asked, "Master, I thought you taught us not to be attached to material things. Why are you crying?" And the master said, "I'm not attached to my home, but I loved it. I have no need to own it forever. But I also have no need to pretend it didn't matter." Detachment doesn't mean you stop feeling, it means you stop letting your feelings own you. That's the distinction most people miss. Equanimity is not the absence of emotion, it's the presence of balance. You can feel sadness without becoming sad. You can feel anger without becoming angry. You can be touched by life without being destroyed by it. You're not running from your humanity. You're not transcending your emotions like they're some lower thing to rise above. You're just not drowning in them anymore. But when the ego takes over, when detachment becomes a badge you wear, you start judging people who still feel things intensely. You roll your eyes at their drama. You feel superior when they cry over something you think is small. You pull away from connection because connection feels messy and you've worked so hard to be clean. And in doing so, you lose the very thing that makes life worth living. You lose intimacy. You lose realness. You lose the raw, honest, beautiful chaos of being human. The Buddha didn't sit under the tree to stop feeling. He sat there to stop suffering. And suffering comes from resistance, not from feeling. It comes from clinging to pleasure and running from pain. But when you're truly free, you don't need to cling or run. You can sit with all of it. The grief, the joy, the uncertainty, the loss. And you're okay, not because you've numbed yourself, but because you've stopped making your peace dependent on life being comfortable. So here's the question you have to ask yourself, and you have to ask it honestly. Are you detached, or are you just defended? Are you calm, or are you just shut down? Are you at peace, or are you just avoiding the places where peace hasn't arrived yet? If someone you love is in pain and you feel nothing, that's not detachment. That's dissociation. If you can watch injustice and shrug because it's all just karma, that's not wisdom. That's apathy. If you've stopped letting people in because being close feels like too much effort, that's not freedom. That's loneliness pretending to be enlightenment. True detachment doesn't make you less human. It makes you more human. It lets you feel without being controlled by the feeling. It lets you love without needing to possess. It lets you care without falling apart when things don't go your way. It's the difference between a tree that's rigid and breaks in the storm and a tree that bends, that moves with the wind, that survives because it knows how to yield without losing itself. And the hardest part? Even the realization that you've been spiritually bypassing, that you've been hiding behind detachment, can become another form of ego. Look at me. I'm humble enough to see my own ego. It never ends. The mind will always try to turn insight into identity. The only way through is to stop trying to be anything at all. Not detached, not enlightened, not healed. Just here, just honest, just willing to see what's true, even when it's uncomfortable, and when even the identity of being detached dissolves. When you stop performing peace, and just let yourself be whatever you are in this moment, messy, uncertain, still learning, something truer begins to move. Act 5. When desire becomes Dharma. So if desire causes suffering, does that mean you're supposed to want nothing? Does freedom mean becoming an empty shell, going through life with no preferences, no dreams, no direction, just existing in some neutral, flavorless state where nothing matters and nothing moves you? No. Because here's what most people miss when they hear desire is the root of suffering. Not all desire is the same. There are two kinds of desire, and only one of them destroys you. The first kind comes from lack, from the feeling that you're incomplete, that something is missing, that you won't be okay until you get the thing. This desire is loud, it's urgent, it keeps you awake at night. It whispers, if you don't have this, you're not enough. If you lose this, you'll fall apart. This is the desire that grips, that chokes, that turns love into possession and ambition into desperation. This is the desire the Buddha was talking about. The one that keeps you running on a treadmill, chasing things that never satisfy because the hole you're trying to fill isn't actually about the thing. It's about the belief that you're broken. But then there's the second kind, the kind that comes from wholeness, from alignment, from a place inside you that's already full and just wants to express itself. This desire doesn't scream, it hums. It moves you forward, but it doesn't drag you. It's the desire to create, not because you need validation, but because something in you wants to come alive. It's the desire to help, not because you're trying to prove you're good, but because you see suffering and your hands naturally reach out. It's the desire to love, not because you're trying to complete yourself, but because your heart is already whole and it has something to give. This second kind? That's not suffering. That's purpose. That's what some traditions call Dharma, your path, your work. The thing you're here to do, not because you have to, but because it's what flows naturally from who you are when you stop pretending to be someone else. And the difference between the two kinds of desire is easy to feel once you know what to look for. Desire that comes from lack feels draining. Even when you get what you want, there's no lasting relief. Just a brief high, and then the hunger returns. You're never satisfied because the satisfaction you're seeking isn't actually in the thing. It's in the story that once you have the thing, you'll finally be enough. And that story is a lie. So you keep chasing, keep accumulating, keep achieving, and the emptiness stays. But desire that comes from wholeness feels different. It energizes you. It doesn't deplete. You can work hard, care deeply, pour yourself into something, and instead of feeling exhausted, you feel more alive. There's no desperation in it, no clinging, no obsession with outcomes. You're doing the thing because doing it feels aligned, and whether it succeeds in the way you hoped becomes almost secondary. Not because you don't care, but because the doing itself is already complete. You're not working towards some future moment when you'll finally feel okay. You feel okay now, and the work is just an expression of that. There's a story about a farmer who planted a garden every spring. Someone asked him, "What if the rain doesn't come? What if the plants don't grow?" And the farmer said, "Then I'll have spent the season with my hands in the soil, and that's enough." That's Dharma. The action itself is the point, not because you've given up on outcomes, but because the outcome isn't where your peace lives. When you live from this place, you stop performing. You stop trying to be spiritual. You stop checking to see if you're detached enough, calm enough, enlightened enough. You just show up. You do the next thing that feels true. You let yourself want things without needing them. You let yourself care without falling apart when things don't go your way. And you realize that the ultimate letting go isn't about releasing your desires. It's about releasing the story that your desires define your worth. This is the final layer, the deepest one. You let go of outcomes. You let go of control. You let go of the ego's need to be seen as detached. And then, if you go far enough, you let go of even the idea that you're someone who's let go. No labels, no identity, not detached or spiritual or awakened. Just here, just alive, just moving through life with as much honesty and kindness as you can manage in this moment. Because the truth is, you're not trying to become something you're not. You're trying to stop pretending to be something you never were. You're not broken and working toward wholeness. You're already whole, just covered in layers of stories and fears and shoulds. And every time you let go of one of those layers, you don't become more. You become more yourself. The Buddha said, "You yourself, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection, not because you've achieved something, not because you've finally become disciplined or detached or good enough, but because you're here, because you're alive. Because beneath all the noise and the striving and the fear, there's a quiet presence that's been whole all along. It's been waiting for you to stop chasing long enough to notice it." So, what does it actually look like to live this way? It's simpler than you think. And harder, because it requires you to stop performing and start being honest. It looks like working on something you care about without checking your phone every 5 minutes to see if it's been validated. It looks like loving someone without needing them to love you back in a specific way to prove you're lovable. It looks like being disappointed and not making it mean you failed. It looks like wanting things and also being okay if they don't come. It looks like showing up, doing your best, and then going to bed without replaying the day 100 times, wondering if you said the right thing, did the right thing, were enough. It's not flashy. It's not impressive. It doesn't look like enlightenment in the movies. It's quiet. It's ordinary. It's just you living your life, without the constant inner war about whether you're doing it right. And here's the final truth. The one that no one can give you. The one you have to discover for yourself. If it's meant for you, it will come. Not because the universe is some vending machine where you put in good behavior and get rewards, but because when you stop standing in your own way, when you stop grasping, forcing, performing, chasing, you create space. And in that space, what's truly aligned with you can finally arrive. Not as a reward, just as a natural consequence of no longer blocking the flow. You've been holding your breath for so long. It's time to exhale. It's time to trust that the next breath will come. It's time to stop demanding that life look a certain way and start noticing what's already here. Not because you've given up, but because you've finally stopped fighting. And in that quiet surrender, something truer than control, truer than fear, truer than all your ideas about how life should be, begins to move. It's been there all along. You just had to get out of the way. So here you are, at the end of this conversation. And maybe something in you feels different. Not fixed, not complete, just softer. A little more willing to unclench. A little more ready to trust that you don't have to hold everything together by force. The work isn't over. It never is. You'll forget this tomorrow. You'll catch yourself gripping again, controlling again, trying to force life into the shape you think it needs to be. And that's okay. That's not failure. That's just being human. The practice isn't about never holding on. It's about noticing when you are, and gently, without judgment, choosing to open your hand. You don't have to be perfect at letting go. You just have to be willing to try, willing to see where you're still holding on out of fear instead of love, willing to plant seeds without digging them up every day, willing to aim carefully and then release the arrow, trusting that your job is done. Because here's what I hope you take with you. If it's meant for you, it will come, not because you chased it, not because you controlled every variable or manipulated every outcome, but because you finally stopped standing in its way. You stopped making your peace dependent on having it. You stopped exhausting yourself trying to force the timing. And in that space, in that quiet surrender, life could finally reach you. That's not giving up. That's growing up. That's understanding that you're not here to control the river. You're here to learn how to swim. So, take a breath, a real one. Let your shoulders drop. Let the weight fall. You've been carrying it long enough. And if this resonated with you, if something here landed in a place that needed to hear it, leave me one word in the comments. Just one. The word that feels most true for you right now. Maybe it's release. Maybe it's trust. Maybe it's something else entirely. I'll read it, and I'll know you were here. You're not alone in this. And you're doing better than you think.